He found a tunnel under his barn, entered it, and realized he'd never come back the same. The wind carried dust through the old wooden beams of the barn, as if whispering secrets too old to be remembered. It was late autumn, and the last of the leaves scraped across the dry earth. At the far edge of the property, the barn sat quiet, untouched since the funeral. Outside, villagers gathered near the churchyard, their voices hushed, their eyes glancing sideways at a woman standing alone. Ruth Bennett, once the mayor's daughter, now wore shame like a second skin. Her husband's death in a fire that consumed half their home had left the town muttering behind her back. Some claimed she'd let it happen. Others whispered darker things, that she was cursed, touched by grief in a way that unsettled even the bravest men. At the auction yard days ago, she'd tried to sell what little was left. A mule, some old pans, a worn quilt. One man laughed and offered a penny, just to see her tremble. She didn't. She stood tall, spine rigid, eyes flat like river stones, but everyone could see it. She had nothing left, not even pride. On the edge of that same town, Thomas Reed watched from his porch. A rancher with more silence than stories. He didn't speak much since the war. He just watched. And today, he watched her. Not with pity, but with something else. Something like remembering. Something like recognition. What he didn't know was that beneath his barn, an old tunnel waited. A place forgotten by time. A place that had once carried secrets between men during the war, secrets too heavy for daylight, and soon he would descend into it, not to escape her, but to find her again, in a way neither of them expected. Ruth hadn't always been this ghost of a woman. Once, her name turned heads and softened eyes. She was the girl who brought wildflowers to schoolteachers and fresh bread to the old woman who lived alone. Her father, Mayor Bennett, had called her his heart, but that heart had long stopped beating the day he died from fever and left her in the care of a mother too broken to stay sober and too bitter to show love. She married Harold because she wanted out, not because she believed in love. He was charming at first, in that smooth-talking way men often are before they know they own you. By the time she saw the truth, the ring was already on her finger, and her last name had changed. The bruises came slowly, like rain in a dry season. First a word, then a grip, then silence, stretched over days. He drank to forget something Ruth never dared ask about. She stopped asking questions, stopped speaking much at all. She lost a baby once, only a few weeks along. Harold never spoke of it, just drank more. That night, she sat alone on the back porch while the stars spun overhead, and she bled into a rag until morning. No one came. No one knew. Or if they did, they looked away. When the fire happened, Harold had been locked inside the shed with a bottle and a kerosene lamp. Ruth was out fetching water. By the time she ran back, it was too late. The flames climbed high and fast, and no one tried to help. The town said she lit it, that she stood and watched, but no one asked her what really happened. They whispered when she passed, "That's the barren widow. Cursed woman." Even the children learned to avoid her shadow. She carried shame that wasn't hers to bear, and still she walked through town each Sunday, her back straight, eyes forward. She didn't ask for kindness. She didn't expect it either. Everywhere she went, she felt like a weed among roses, unwanted, untended, left to crack the earth on her own. But weeds were stubborn things, and Ruth Bennett, for all the sorrow she carried, hadn't given up yet. She just needed a place where silence didn't sting, a place where dignity wasn't something that had to be earned back every day. She didn't know it yet, but that place was under an old barn, where secrets lived, and something else waited. Something like healing. Thomas Reed lived on the edge of town, just beyond the old cottonwoods where the hills began to rise. Folks didn't talk much about him, but when they did, it was in tones that fell quiet halfway through a sentence. Some said he'd buried a brother in the war. Others said he returned different, not angry, just quiet, like someone who learned early that words couldn't fix what mattered most. His ranch was modest but solid. Fences were always mended, Animals fed before sundown, and no one ever saw him drunk. He didn't attend church, but he paid the preacher's boy to fix the roof without ever saying a word about it. He wasn't handsome in the way young girls daydreamed about. He was older than Ruth by nearly 10 years, with a weathered face and hands that looked like they remembered every fence post they'd ever built. But there was something in his stillness that made people straighten up when he entered a room. He first saw Ruth at the cattle auction, not long after the fire. She was standing beside her mule, shoulders squared, chin lifted, while two men behind her made jokes they didn't think she could hear. One even spat near her feet. Thomas watched her jaw tighten, her hands not flinch. She didn't answer back, didn't move. And something about that moment, her silence, her control, struck him harder than any sermon ever had. He didn't speak to her then, just nodded once, not as a greeting, but in acknowledgement, like he saw her standing in that ring of shame and knew what it took to not fold. He noticed things others missed, how her dress had been stitched at the sides by hand, how she let the mule drink before she did. She had nothing, but she carried herself like a woman who still remembered the shape of dignity. That night, Thomas walked back to his barn, the sky above painted with stars. He leaned on the gate, thinking about her. There were voices and town that wrote her off, claimed she was cursed or cruel or barren. But Thomas didn't believe in curses. He believed in silence, in watching people when they thought no one saw. And what he saw was a woman still standing when every reason not to had already been given. He didn't know her name, but he knew she had no place to go. And in the quiet of his barn, something old stirred. Not pity, not desire, but something steadier. A thought, perhaps, or a beginning. The next Sunday, the wind howled through town like it wanted to peel back the roofs. Most stayed home from church. Ruth still came, her shawl wrapped tight, shoes worn through at the heels. She swept the wooden steps clean before anyone arrived, her fingers numb but determined. No one thanked her. No one noticed, except Thomas Reed, leaning against the fence across the road, his hat low against the cold. When the service ended, Ruth stepped around the side of the building, heading toward the back path that would take her to the schoolhouse. Thomas followed without hurrying. She heard his steps, but didn't turn. She'd grown used to men trailing her. For the wrong reasons. "Miss Bennet," he said quietly. She stopped, half expecting some remark about the fire or her past. Instead, he held out a cloth-wrapped bundle. "For your hands." She blinked. It wasn't food, not money. It was a pair of gloves. Thick, leather, patched at the thumbs, but warm. "I saw you sweeping," he said. "Can't fix the wind, but maybe this'll help." She stared at the gloves for a long moment, then at him. "I can't pay you for them," she said, her voice rough but steady. "Not asking you to," he replied. "I could use some help on the ranch. Nothing heavy. Just things I don't get to." A job. That's what he was offering. Ruth's first instinct was to refuse. She'd heard those offers before, always followed by eyes that lingered too long or were words that turned sharp when she didn't return the attention. But his tone wasn't demanding. He wasn't smiling, wasn't looking at her the way others did. He looked steady. That was the only word she could find. "What kind of work?" she asked. "Sorting tools, cleaning tack, minding the hens, that sort." She looked at the gloves again. They were warm in her hands. Real. Needed. "All right," she said finally. "But I come in daylight, and I leave before supper." Thomas nodded once. Fair. He didn't ask more, didn't push. Just turned and walked away, his boots crunching gravel. She watched him go, the gloves pressed to her chest. That night, Ruth sat alone in the schoolhouse, the gloves in her lap. She hadn't been offered kindness in a long time, not without a cost. But this felt different. Not pity. Not charity. Respect. and that felt like the first true thing she'd held in years. Ruth came every morning just after sunrise. She crossed the field in her patched shawl, boots still cracking at the seams, and stepped through the rusted gate of Thomas Reed's ranch like someone entering sacred ground. She never asked questions, just got to work. The first few days were quiet. Thomas showed her where the feed sacks were, where the hens nested, how the saddle oil should be rubbed in slow, patient circles. She listened carefully, nodded once, then did what needed doing. But she was nervous. It showed in her hands. She spilled oats the first time. A full scoop, right into the mud. "Leave it," Thomas said gently. "Birds'll have it." She dropped a bit of the saddle oil on the barn floor, her fingers slick with cold. "Sorry," she mumbled. Thomas just handed her a rag. Oil's meant to move. She expected correction, maybe impatience, but it never came. Not once did he raise his voice or give her that look most men did. That sharp, dismissive glance that said, "You're lucky I let you stay." Instead, Thomas moved slow, steady, as though time wasn't something he counted in minutes, but in mercy. By the end of the week, Ruth had organized the barn wall. Every bridle, brush, and the hook neatly hung. She even fixed a broken shelf in the pantry using wood scraps from the yard. Thomas noticed, didn't say much, just placed a small wooden comb on the windowsill of the tack room where she kept her things. She found it the next morning, smoothed down, simple, carved with a flower on one end. She didn't ask. He didn't explain. But she slipped it into her pocket and didn't take it out for days. The struggle came quietly, like it always did with healing. One afternoon she dropped a pail near the barn and sat down hard on the ground. Not from the weight, but from the memory. A small boy had passed with his father riding a cart. The child pointed at her, whispered something. The father turned his face away like shame could be caught on the wind. Thomas saw her there, shoulders hunched, hands gripping her knees. He didn't ask what happened, just walked into the house and came back with a blanket, thick, woolen, smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. He handed it to her without a word, then sat a few feet away in the dirt. Said nothing, just sat. They both stared at the hills beyond the barn as the sun dipped low and gold across the fields. Later that evening she found something else on her workbench. A piece of paper with charcoal marks, a sketch, rough but clear. It was the barn, and in front of it, a woman sweeping hay. Her back was straight, her face was quiet, but her presence filled the frame. She turned it over. No name, no note. Just a simple drawing, folded once, left like an offering. The next morning she arrived earlier than usual, with her hair combed back and the blanket tucked under her arm. Something was shifting, not loudly, not suddenly, but like spring under snow, the kind of change that doesn't ask permission. And Ruth, for the first time in years, didn't feel like a guest in someone else's story. She was beginning to belong. The Sitches, healed, appeared on the 5th Sunday. Ruth had just finished mending a torn saddlebag in the tack room when she heard light footsteps, too soft to be Thomas, too bold to be the wind. She turned, and there she was. A girl, no more than 5, with straw-colored hair in 2 crooked braids and a crooked smile to match. She held a wooden horse in one hand, its tail worn to a nub, and stared at Ruth with wide, unblinking eyes. Ruth froze. She hadn't known Thomas had a child. Before she could speak, the girl marched forward and placed the horse on the bench beside her. "Papa said you're helping." Ruth nodded slowly. "I am." The girl studied her like she was a riddle she already knew the answer to. "You're pretty," she declared. Ruth blinked. No one had said that to her in years, not since before the fire, before the shame. She cleared her throat, suddenly unsure of where to place her hands. "Thank you. What's your name?" "Clara. I'm 5. I live here now. With Papa." She looked at the comb on the table, then up at Ruth's hair. "You can use it, you know. He carved it." Ruth managed a small smile. "I know." Clara swung her legs and hummed a tune only children could remember. Then, casually, as if saying the sky was blue or the cows were loud, she asked, "Are you going to be my mama?" The words dropped like a stone in a still pond. Ruth felt her breath catch. The girl wasn't joking, wasn't teasing, just asking a question the way children do. Pure, innocent, without the weight of grown-up pain. She looked toward the door, expecting Thomas to appear, to take the child away or apologize or explain. But no one came. I don't know," Ruth whispered. Clara nodded once, satisfied. "You can be, if you want. You already make the barn smell nice." Then she slid off the bench and skipped out as if nothing had happened. Ruth stood there, trembling. Not from fear, but from something older, something softer. She picked up the comb and with slow hands began to run it through her hair. Outside, the wind blew, lifting dust and old memories into the sky. And somewhere deep inside her, past the ruin and the silence, a wall cracked. Not from fire, not from pain, from hope. It began with a whisper, as most cruelty does. A woman from town, Mrs. Langley, stopped by the ranch under the pretense of buying eggs. Ruth was outside feeding the hens, her sleeves rolled up, face flushed from the sun. Thomas was in the barn, Clara napping on a quilt beneath the porch. Mrs. Langley tilted her head, eyes sharp behind her bonnet. "Didn't expect to see you here, Ruth. Wearing a man's boots, no less." Ruth straightened, brushing her hands on her apron. "Just working." The woman chuckled, the kind that tastes sour. "Is that what they call it these days?" She left with a basket of eggs and a smirk. By evening, the gossip had already reached town. 2 days later, Harold's brother arrived. His name was Martin Lyle, but folks called him Marty. A wiry man with slicked-back hair and a voice like gravel soaked in whiskey. He hadn't spoken to Ruth since the funeral, hadn't come to the house, hadn't sent word. But now he stood at the ranch gate like he owned it. Thomas saw him first. He stepped off the porch, slow, arms folded. "Can I help you?" "I'm here for Ruth," Marty said. "Family business." Ruth stepped out of the barn, wiping sweat from her brow. When she saw him, she froze. Marty smiled without warmth. "Didn't expect to find you shacked up on a stranger's land." "She's working," Thomas said, voice low. Marty ignored him. "Town's buzzing, you know. A widow shamed by fire, living on a ranch with a man who says nothing and a kid calling her mama. Doesn't look good." Ruth kept her voice calm. "What do you want, Marty?" He stepped forward, lowering his voice. "There's still land in Harold's name. You might think you lost it, but there's papers. I could help. For a share. Or maybe you just leave town. Would make things easier." "You didn't care about the land before, sir," he said, eyes narrowing. "Well, now I do. And let's be honest, Ruth. Your reputation ain't worth spit. But if you walk away quiet, I'll keep my mouth shut." Thomas stepped between them, his shadow falling long in the dirt. "You done?" he asked. Marty smirked. "This isn't your fight, rancher." "It is now." There was a silence then, deep and thick. Even the wind seemed to pause. Marty's smile faded. He turned without another word and walked off, boots crunching on gravel. That night Ruth sat at the edge of the porch. Her hands shook, though she tried to hide it. Thomas came out, handed her a mug of warm tea. "I'm not ashamed of what I've done," she whispered. "I know. But I'm tired of running from what they think I did." Thomas nodded, eyes on the dark horizon. "Then don't run." He didn't offer promises, didn't say he'd fix it. But he stayed there, beside her. And in that silence, Ruth felt safer than she had in years. Still, she knew Marty would come back. And next time, he wouldn't come alone. It began with a whisper, as most cruelty does. A woman from town, Mrs. Langley, stopped by the ranch under the pretense of buying eggs. Ruth was outside feeding the hens, her sleeves rolled up, face flushed from the sun. Thomas was in the barn, Clara napping on a quilt beneath the porch. Mrs. Langley tilted her head, eyes sharp behind her bonnet. "Didn't expect to see you here, Ruth. Wearing a man's boots, no less." Ruth straightened, brushing her hands on her apron. "Just working." The woman chuckled, the kind that tastes sour. "Is that what they call it these days?" She left with a basket of eggs and a smirk. By evening, the gossip had already reached town. 2 days later, Harold's brother arrived. His name was Martin Lyle, but folks called him Marty. A wiry man with slicked-back hair and a voice like gravel soaked in whiskey. He hadn't spoken to Ruth since the funeral. Hadn't come to the house. Hadn't sent word. But now he stood at the ranch gate like he owned it. Thomas saw him first. He stepped off the porch, slow, arms folded. "Can I help you?" "I'm here for Ruth," Marty said. "Family business." Ruth stepped out of the barn, wiping sweat from her brow. When she saw him, she froze. Marty smiled without warmth. "Didn't expect to find you shacked up on a stranger's land." "She's working," Thomas said, voice low. Marty ignored him. "Town's buzzing, you know. A widow shamed by fire. Living on a ranch with a man who says nothing and a kid calling her mama. Doesn't look good." Ruth kept her voice calm. "What do you want, Marty?" He stepped forward, lowering his voice. "There's still land in Harold's name. You might think you lost it, but there's papers. I could help, for a share. Or maybe you just leave town. Would make things easier." "You didn't care about the land before," she said, eyes narrowing. "Well, now I do. And let's be honest, Ruth, your reputation ain't worth spit. But if you walk away quiet, I'll keep my mouth shut." Thomas stepped between them, his shadow falling long in the dirt. "You done?" he asked. Marty smirked. "This isn't your fight, rancher." "It is now." There was a silence then, deep and thick. Even the wind seemed to pause. Marty's smile faded. He turned without another word and walked off, boots crunching on gravel. That night, Ruth sat at the edge of the porch. Her hands shook, though she tried to hide it. Thomas came out, handed her a mug of warm tea. "I'm not ashamed of what I've done," she whispered. "I know, but I'm tired of running from what they think I did." Thomas nodded, eyes on the dark horizon. "Then don't run." He didn't offer promises, didn't say he'd fix it. But he stayed there, beside her. And in that silence, Ruth felt safer than she had in years. Still, she knew Marty would come back. And next time, he wouldn't come alone. The morning after the fair, something changed in town. For the first time in years, Ruth didn't have to lower her eyes when she walked past the general's store. Mr. Harper, who once refused to sell her flour on credit, tipped his hat and called her Miss Bennett. The schoolteacher waved from the steps. Children whispered, not with cruelty but curiosity. They had all seen it. How she ran without hesitation. How she put herself between a charging horse and a child not her own. How she bled and stood up without crying, without complaint. Ruth returned to the ranch that day, with Clara holding one hand and a bundle of bread and apples in the other. Gifts from townsfolk who hadn't spoken her name kindly in years. Thomas met her at the gate. Said nothing at first. She offered the apples. "We've been noticed," she said quietly. He took the bundle. "Told you, respect takes time." That Sunday, Ruth stepped into church alone. Heads turned. This time, no one whispered. She sat near the front. When the service ended, the pastor's wife touched her arm gently. "You're welcome to join the harvest choir if you like. We could use a voice like yours." Ruth didn't answer right away. Her heart thudded. Then she nodded once. "I'd like that." Outside, the mayor, the same man who had once asked her not to return to town meetings after the fire, extended his hand. "I'm sorry," he said plainly. "We were wrong." Ruth didn't cry, didn't bow, just met his hand with hers, firm and steady. And just like that, the past lost its grip on her. She wasn't the cursed widow anymore. She was the woman who ran toward danger. The woman who stayed. The woman who stood beside a child, beside a man, beside herself, and didn't flinch. The first frost came early that year. Thomas had just finished stacking the last of the winter wood behind the barn when he saw her, Ruth, sitting on the back porch, wrapped in the same wool blanket he'd once given her. Clara was inside, humming softly as she rearranged a drawer full of mismatched buttons. Ruth's hands were still, resting on her lap. Thomas walked over, not with purpose, but with quiet resolve. He sat beside her without speaking for a while, both of them watching the light drain from the hills. "You thinking of leaving?" he asked finally. Ruth glanced sideways. "Should I be?" He shook his head. "No, but I've learned not to assume someone will stay just because they're here." She studied his face. "You're not the kind of man to ask a woman to stay just so you won't be lonely." "No," he said, "but I'm the kind that would ask her if she wanted something more than just a place to work." Silence sat between them. Not awkward, just honest. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small carved object wrapped in a piece of cloth. He placed it gently in her hands. She unwrapped it slowly. It was a wooden ring box, smoothed down, warm to the touch. Inside, not gold, not silver, but a ring of polished iron, shaped by his own hand, hammered flat, the inside lined with a small strip of red fabric. Ruth blinked, her fingers trembling. "I don't have a lot of words," Thomas said, "but I've built you a room, next to mine. It's got a window that faces the pasture, and a door that locks, from the inside." He turned to her, voice low and steady. "I'm not asking for anything you can't give. I just want you to know that if you stay, it's your choice. No pity, no weight, just a life. Ours, if you want it." Ruth didn't speak for a long time. Her fingers closed over the ring. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. Finally she nodded once. "I want it." Thomas reached over and placed his hand on hers. And that was it. No grand kiss, no music. Just two people, tired of pain, choosing love in the quietest way. Years passed like the wind across open fields, sometimes soft, sometimes cutting, but always moving forward. Ruth never became the loudest woman in town, but she became the most respected. People came to her for advice, for bread, for quiet strength. She planted flowers along the ranch fence, taught Clara how to sew, tended chickens with the same care she once gave to her sorrow. The rose Thomas built for her became hers in name, then theirs in time. Not out of duty, not out of need, but from choice, the rarest kind of love. They never spoke much about the fire, the gossip, or the